Welcome to the Seminole Wars. In this podcast, we explore how the Seminole Wars came to be, how they were fought, and how they still resonate some 2 centuries later. I am your host, Patrick Swan, and our show is a production of the Seminole Wars Foundation, found online at www.seminolewars.us. We are recording today from the homestead of the Foundation in Bushnell, Florida. Thank you for listening. Oh, and welcome back. We ended our last episode in September of 1812, just before Georgia Militia Colonel Daniel Newnan prepared to lead an attack on the Seminole Indian settlement called Paynestown in the fertile Alachua region of north-central Florida. Newnan sought retribution against the Seminole for, well, we're not clear precisely why. Was it because the Seminole backed the Spanish government and Saint Augustine rather than maintain neutrality against the illegal Patriot invasion? Was it because the Georgia militia felt humiliated from an attack by Black Militia and Black Maroon Seminoles? Although the attackers did don Indian war paint, the Alachua Seminoles were not part of or behind the attack. Maybe they just thought that as a Spanish ally, the Seminoles would be an easy mark to whom they could teach a lesson, since they could not get inside the Spanish-held garrison at the Castillo de San Marcos. It is not as if a persuasive justification was needed. The Patriots were mostly land-hungry Georgians, posing as Floridians who were disgruntled with Spanish rule. They sought an imagined reason, or no reason at all, to stoke an uprising, so they could declare a republic and obtain American recognition for evicting the Spanish. Then they would accrue the spoils. The Alachua band of Seminole Indians resided on a main trading route close to Saint Augustine, and who possibly, the Patriots weren't sure, had wealth to pillage and plunder. Thus did events bring Georgians, and by extension Americans as a whole, into their first large-scale encounter with the feisty Alachua Seminole Indians. Although Newnan's raid itself was ill-fated, it almost became Newnan's massacre with his force wiped out. It did expose the Georgians to the Seminoles' rich and fertile grazing and farming land. This first contact discovery would, pardon the expression, plant the seed for a return later to take possession of this territory, with or without Seminole consent. The raid became a pivotal and perhaps inaugural battle that ushered in a half-century of contention and conflict between the United States and the many bands and tribes comprising the Seminole Indians of Florida. These wars ultimately left the Seminole battered severely, partially removed to Oklahoma, but in the end, unconquered in Florida when it was all said and done. This episode picks up as Newnan departs to find, fix, and destroy the Seminole, and win some booty for his troops in the process. With us again to explain it all is Doctor James Cusick. As we have mentioned, Dr. Cusick wrote about this in the other war of 1812, the Patriot War and the American invasion of Spanish East Florida. Dr. Jim Cusick, welcome back to the Seminole Wars.
Thank you, Patrick.
We left off with an impending military operation against the Seminole. Please give us a recap of where we are and who's in charge of it.
Okay, well, I think for context, we'll just say that this happens in 1812. And at that time, Florida is a Spanish colony, but it is under American military occupation. And we're not going to go into why there was an American military occupation. The important thing is that American forces were pitted against Spanish forces. And the Seminole of the Alachua area decided to come in on the side of the Spanish. So what we're going to talk about is one of the major engagement of this combat. And also it's the first time that Seminole warriors go up against American forces in a major way. It's the very first time. And to history, it's usually known as Newnan's Raid or Newnan's Battle.
Who was Colonel Daniel Newnan, and what was he attempting to do with his march to Paynestown?
Colonel Daniel Newnan was by birth from North Carolina, attended University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, relocated to Georgia, became Adjutant General of Georgia, and at this time, in late September of 1812, he was in command of the Georgia Volunteers, which was a contingent of Georgia militia, about 250 men, who had been brought down into Florida to support American forces there. Newnan became convinced that the American position in Florida would be untenable as long as the Seminole continued to be in the field helping Spanish forces. And he decided to make a strike against the main town of the Seminoles over in what's today Alachua County, south of where the University of Florida is, quite near to Micanopy. So he put this plan to his volunteers, and about half the men agreed to go with him. They were militia, so for many of them their terms of service were up. Quite a few of them did not like the idea of trying to hit the Seminole in their home territory. They had come to realize that the Seminole were a formidable opponent. But this didn't deter Newnan. He decided to proceed with about 117 men. And in late September of 1812, he crossed the St. Johns River at Fort Piccolata, and he proceeded west towards the Alachua territory.
He never reached Paynestown. What happened?
Well, he made very good progress. In 3 days of march, he and his 117 men were getting close to where Paynestown was. That was the principal town of the area, and it was named after the Seminole headman, the Seminole chief, Payne, or King Payne. They were approaching it from the northeast. Basically, on modern geography, they were marching down along the eastern shore of what today is called Lake Newnan. And as they got close to the town, quite by coincidence, there was a Seminole raiding party which was setting out in the other direction. And it was led by Payne, who was in his late 70s or 80s at that time, and it was composed of about 80 warriors. And so the two groups literally kind of bumped into each other unexpectedly. They had about the same number of men, because when Newnan prepared to engage in battle, he sent some of his men to the right, which would have been towards the lake, and they got round behind some sort of depression or sinkhole that blocked their advance, and that kind of took them out of the engagement, at least initially. So it was about 80 men on one side versus 80 men on the other side. The Seminole pulled back because they didn't even have their guns loaded. They had not expected to encounter a hostile force so close to their town. So they dropped back and prepared their guns, and both sides took cover in the terrain and behind the trees, began a long shooting volley that went on and on and on for 2.5 hours, where they were basically, concealing themselves or keeping under cover, but firing at the other side.
The battle, dubbed historically as Newnan's Raid, was inconclusive, although both sides suffered casualties. Why was Newnan's force at a disadvantage, though?
After this first engagement of 2.5 hours, both sides were beginning to run low on their ammunition. They had to begin to conserve powder. For about 5 hours, there was a ceasefire. Newnan used that time to send mounted men, couriers, back east to get help. And he also had his men build a breastwork so that they would have protection. At the same time, there were reinforcements coming to the Seminole side. At the end of 5 hours, instead of 80 warriors, the Seminole had 250. They outnumbered Newnan's men by more than 2 to 1. And of course, the new warriors, the warriors who had arrived, also came with supplies of gunpowder. Newnan was pinned down. He couldn't retreat, at least not easily, and so his option was to wait on his couriers and hold out until he could receive reinforcement. For 7 days, his men were trapped in this breastwork that they had built, repelling fire from the Seminole. The Seminole didn't attempt an overwhelming assault, but they were keeping up kind of a steady volley of fires. Again, they were still trying to conserve ammunition, and Newnan was trying to conserve ammunition. The big factor for Newnan was he was running out of food. And over the course of 7 days, they had to kill the horses and eat the horses. No help came. There was no sign of any returning couriers. He was forced, basically, to retreat and fight a rearguard action against superior military force as he tried to make his way back to the St. Johns River. The first day, I think they only made it 8 miles before the exchange of fire became so heated that they had to stop and build another redoubt and take shelter behind it. So this was the circumstances that he was in. He was 70 miles from safety. He was on foot. He was low on ammunition. His men were low on ammunition. They were low on food, and they had to protect themselves from twice as many Seminole warriors who were mobile and could move about around. In the middle of all this extended into early October. Apparently a late hurricane season storm came up. I don't know if it was a hurricane or a northeaster, but it blew through the area. Severe winds. The winds were snapping the pine trees in half, forced both sides to take shelter. And so for another 5 or 6 days, Newnan had to essentially fight his way backwards towards the St. Johns River before he finally ran into a relief party who could defend him and tend to his wounded. He was 3 days going into this raid to get to Paynestown, and he was 2 weeks extricating himself back out from it again.
Hunkered down behind breastworks, low on ammunition, outnumbered. Sounds a little bit like what Major Dade's command faced. What are the similarities, what are the differences, and how close did Daniel Newnan come to emulating Dade's fate 2 decades later?
Well, it was very similar. The major difference and the most important difference was that the ambush of Major Dade by the Seminoles was a plan that had been worked out in advance. They planned that ambush. This was an accidental engagement. Neither side had expected to encounter the other. And I think probably what saved Newnan was that the Seminoles had expended a lot of ammunition in the original engagement, and they had to be careful with their ammunition so they could keep up a sporadic fire on him, but they couldn't really launch an assault. And of course every day he was getting closer to the American lines, and they were getting further away from their home territory, and that may have influenced things as well. But I can tell you that when he finally made it back to the St. Johns River, he emphasized the fact that they had inflicted a lot of casualties on the Seminole, and that he felt he could claim a victory by the fact that he had gotten that far and gotten back out. But the other military commanders, American military commanders in Florida, didn't see it that way, and neither did the governor of Georgia, who said that he thought Newnan had been incredibly lucky to get out of that situation and to bring his men out of that situation alive. However, it did make Newnan famous. He was already well known in Georgia, and this made him a folk hero in Georgia. And there were immediate calls to avenge him, basically. Even the governor of Georgia, David Mitchell, who generally had not been in favor of extending hostilities in Florida, even he felt that the situation that Newnan endured called for some type of retaliatory strike.
Ironically, this was a retaliatory strike in the first place.
Now they needed a retaliatory strike for the retaliatory strike. And I'll just say again that in terms of larger history, I think the most significant thing about this was prior to this, there had never been kind of a pitched engagement like this between any group of the Seminoles and American force. There were raids and ambushes and very small, kind of skirmish type things. But this was really a major engagement. I think one of the ways it affected the future of the Seminole is that it put them very much on the conscience, of settlers and people, residents in Georgia. It kind of heightened Georgians' awareness of the Seminoles, and it also immediately left Georgians with the conviction that the Seminoles were going to be enemies. Very much colored the relationships that were going to exist after that, and that probably had long-term repercussions.
Patriot War became an Indian War as well, with the kind of anger usually associated with Indian wars. What happened next?
The Patriot War was really the local name for this American occupation. But what had started initially as kind of filibuster, to some extent a kind of revolt against Spanish rule, and then as an American military incursion, it kept snowballing. The engagements kept getting bigger and bigger, and the ramifications of the military occupation began to involve more and more and more people, or at least affect more and more and more people. So the net effect, or the ultimate effect of Newnan's raid and of the repulse of Newnan's raid, was that American troops put together a plan to go back into the Alachua territory and to go back in strength. and to simply put an end to any Seminole military involved from that point on. And it did take months planning to actually put that together. There were debates among military officers on the American side at that time as to whether they even really wanted to go ahead with it. Probably the most ironic thing was that volunteer militia from Tennessee came over the Appalachian Mountains in winter to join the American forces. So that gives you some idea of how far from Florida the news of Newnan's battle had gone. That in Tennessee they were actually raising troops to come down to Florida and to join the mission that was going to go back into Alachua. So ultimately, this next military force headed towards Alachua, and this time there were 225 U.S. troops who were rendezvousing with another 225 to 250 militia troops, so they had a force of 500, double the size of the most number of warriors that the Alachua Seminole community could possibly muster. So in practical terms, it was an overwhelming force. That one actually did not result in any major battle. The Seminole leadership in the area knew that such a force was heading their way. King Payne had been mortally wounded during the engagement with Newnan. He died a few days later on. His near kin, Bole, took over leadership of the Alachua Seminole, and Bole made the decision not to oppose this force. Instead, he withdrew all of his people. They abandoned their town and their agricultural lands and their cattle herds in Alachua, and they went west towards the Suwannee River so they would not have to confront this force that went in. So ultimately, the American expedition that went into Alachua in February of 1813 went in on a search and destroy mission, basically. They seized all the cattle, they burned the cornfields, they burned the town of Paynestown. They came across a couple small hamlets in which there were runaway slaves or Black Maroons still living who had not accompanied the larger community west, and they took them prisoner. And after 4 or 5 days in the area, having seized everything they could seize, they then turned around and went back towards northeast Florida. Now, I do have to say, you were asking about sort of similarities between Newnan's raid and the Dade battle. This second expedition is very similar if people read accounts of the First Seminole War under Andrew Jackson. The First Seminole War was very, very much like this. Second expedition actually kind of set the stage for, what future conflicts were going to be like in 1813, 1814 with the Creek War, and then in 1817, 1818 with the First Seminole War.
The nuance was lost on the American people that the American presence in Florida was illegal.
Yeah, diplomatically it was certainly illegal. And initially it was an incursion that was not actually approved by the administration of President Madison, but which came to be approved. This was kind of a situation where President Madison was presented with a fait accompli in Florida, that American troops had moved across the border and taken up station there. And although there was initial consideration of withdrawing the troops and trying to smooth things over with this government of Spain, very soon after this had happened, war broke out between the United States and Britain in the War of 1812. And from that point on, there was kind of a military requirement, necessity, of trying to hold position on that southern border, that Georgia-Florida border, because, in the initial months of the War of 1812, things were not going well in Canada and for the Americans side of the United States. And so President Madison was very hesitant to have to confront some sort of major military force on the southern border as well. It was initially illegal. It was initially something that the American government was going to retract on, but the War of 1812 changed those circumstances. It kind of, in some ways, legitimized the military occupation because of the danger that might be posed to the Georgia-Alabama territory or Mississippi territory lines if there was no American strength on that southern border.
So what was the outcome of this so-called Patriot War? Who won?
Yet no one won. Very destructive war. I think I characterize it, and this is pretty much true, every rural landholding, plantation, farmstead, anything like that, between the St. Mary's River, which is the Florida-Georgia border, and modern-day Volusia County, New Smyrna, south of Daytona. Everything got either looted or burned during the course of 13 months. The cattle were driven off or taken for provisions or simply killed. American troops suffered a great deal, mostly from hunger and disease, but also from being in a war zone. Saint Augustine was under siege for much of the time, very low on food, people streaming in from the countryside and kind of crammed into the town. And when it was all over, a lot of people went out to find that they were living in a devastated landscape. No food production for a year and a half, so there were no crops, no commercial crops. A lot of the rural housing destroyed. The temporary beneficiaries were probably the rural slave population, because many of them managed to escape from captivity in all the confusion of the war. And others actually joined up with the Seminole. The Seminole would raid the plantations, and the families in the slave quarters would go off with the Seminole. And many of them probably, ironically, ended up over in the Big Bend area, where, of course, a few years later, they were right in the middle of the Creek War and also the First Seminole War. And for a while, Spanish settlers and the Spanish government could count it as a victory, but only a victory because they survived and they were left in possession of the ground. It was a really devastating and economically crippling sort of combat. And not unlike other theaters of the War of 1812, if you look at what was happening up along the New York-Canadian border and around the Great Lakes, was the same sort of thing. A lot of burning of rural properties and rural plantations, and a lot of people turned into refugees. The Creek War was also like that. I mean, the Creek War was essentially won by going in and burning out major creek towns and destroying crops and things to force the Red Stick Creek into a position where they simply couldn't continue to fight anymore. So the whole era of 1812 was one that caused a great deal of suffering, and most people say the War of 1812 didn't really have a winner or a loser and didn't really resolve anything. And the little Patriot War going on in Florida was sort of like that too.
What were near-term effects and long-term effects on the Seminole of this Patriot War?
Well, the nearest term effect was they lost their homeland in Alachua County, but they preserved their community. And Bullocks, did move west and reestablish the community on the Suwannee River. Probably the second near-term effect, as I said, was that it brought the Seminole to the attention of American citizens and residents along the southern borders, in the Mississippi Territory, in Georgia. As I said, even in Tennessee, people suddenly became aware of who the Seminole were and where they were. And so it did become the first of a whole series of conflicts that was going to characterize the relationship between indigenous peoples and American landholders for the next 50, 60 years.
And in some ways led to the Negro Fort and the First Seminole War?
There were definitely connections. I don't know if people know about the so-called Negro Fort, but that fort was actually established by the British, again during the War of 1812, on the Alachua River at Prospect Bluff. It was initially supposed to be a stronghold for Creek allies and for runaway slaves who fled to the British lines. The British were going to turn that group into a fighting force to move against the American South. That military attempt was essentially sort of taken off the table by Andrew Jackson. The defeat of the Creek Red Sticks in the Creek War, that was a factor in it. The later push by Jackson to force the British to leave the Panhandle area was another factor. But the fort remained up on Prospect Bluff, and it eventually became a community, a fairly large community, of runaway slaves and Maroons. More than 300 people there, I think. Ironically, so there was a connection. Many of the people, many of the black men and women who went to that fort were probably former slaves who had, liberated themselves during the Patriot War and gotten free of their plantations on the east side of Florida and ended up on the west side of Florida. And also, a lot of the slaves who ended up with Bolex community, well, they ended up at Bolex-town on the Suwannee, which again, survived for a number of years, but ultimately was one of the targets of Andrew Jackson's forces during the First Seminole War. So yeah, there were there's a lot of continuity, or a lot of connections for people who, were in one of these conflicts and eventually found themselves in yet another one, in a different location.
And coming out of that, the Seminole had to relocate again.
When you look at the expedition that went into Alachua, and when you also look at the First Seminole War, they're very different in scale. First Seminole War is a much bigger engagement, involves many more people, but they're very similar in kind of the way things progressed during them. In the case of Alachua, as I said, Bolex made the decision to sacrifice defending the land in order to preserve the people and moved west. And the American expedition became largely a search and destroy, kind of scorched earth mission of just eliminating any possibility that the Seminole could easily reoccupy that area. The First Seminole War, almost the same thing. Andrew Jackson goes into that area, I think, with a force of about 1,500 men and 1,800 Creek allies. That force is vastly larger than anything that the Seminole at Lake Miccosukee or the Seminole at Bolex-town can oppose. And they don't attempt to oppose it for the most part. If you look at the engagement that occurred during the First Seminole War, the Seminole are mostly fighting rear guard actions. They're mostly just trying to slow the advance of Jackson down to give all the non-combatants a chance to get away. And that's what happens at Lake Miccosukee, and that's what happens later on at Bolex. So the two situations are very similar, and one of the reasons they're similar, I think, is because in both those areas, the Seminoles were very well established. Right? They had towns that had been in existence for decades, or in the case of Lake Miccosukee, for centuries. These were well-known places surrounded by cattle and agricultural fields on well-marked trails, which unfortunately made them very vulnerable to a military expedition. The expedition into Alachua reached Alachua very quickly and left very quickly. Jackson moved through the area of St. Marcos in a matter of weeks. I mean, he was not in that area very long. He moved his troops through there very quickly. And the net result of it was that they destroyed the settlements there. The people themselves retreated to other areas. One of the reasons I think that's important is because I think by the time you get to the Second Seminole War, Seminole leadership realized during the Second Seminole War that they could not fight a war or hold their own if they were going to try and defend towns and agricultural fields that were easily approached. They had already seen what had happened in the two former cases when the American military moved against them. And that may have influenced the strategy of the Second Seminole War, which was that the Seminoles kept themselves in places that were very difficult to get at, and they remained fairly mobile. And as a result, they were able to hold their own for a period of 7 years against American military forces. I think that's something that could be looked at, or could be considered too, when you look at the evolution of how the Seminole were dealing with the world around them, is a very clear perception of what had happened in 1817 and 18. And, by the 1830s, I think they knew that they were going to have to adopt a very different way of combating forces that were coming against them in order to wear them down or to hold out.
Where do we see signs of the Patriot War in the landscape today? In Florida or in Georgia?
Well, there's not a lot of signs of it. Lake Newnan, of course, is still there, and it's still in a very rural area. The principal little communities in that section of Alachua County are Rochelle and Windsor, always been small. I think that there's a historic marker near Rochelle, which is actually dedicated to the history of Rochelle, but it opens up, its opening statements are about Newnan's raid in that area. And then I also think that there's a marker over near Windsor, which is close to the area where Daniel Newnan made his first stand behind the first breastwork.
That is a marker from the Daughters of the American Revolution, in fact.
Yes, it's interesting and probably closely related to Newnan's own personal history. Years ago, the archivist, Jim Powell in Alachua County, sent me a copy of a map from the Windsor area that showed where Newnan's breastwork had been. But it's on private property out there, on farmland. So I've never actually sought permission to go and cross over the land and see what remains of it. But at one time, apparently, could still tell from depressions in the ground and things that there had been a small breastwork readout there. Beyond that, there's the town of Newnan in Georgia is named after Daniel Newnan. Newnansville, which is kind of a ghost town now in Florida, was named after him. Newnansville was originally the county seat for Alachua County, but in the 1850s, the county seat moved to Gainesville, which had the railroad. Newnansville is still there with a historic marker, but it's now on the outskirts of Alachua, which is another small community in Alachua County. And then there have been archaeological surveys done to locate Paynestown. And the location of Paynestown is known now, and there's been some preliminary excavation there, enough, I think, to determine that that particular site was burned, what we know historically about Paynestown. So that's also been verified.
Jim, why should Newnan's raid and its after effects be better known to Floridians specifically and Americans in general?
Well, I think for Floridians, it's an important part of the 19th century history of Florida, and it's a key part to understanding and, I hope, appreciating the tremendous challenges and also the tremendous obstacles that the Seminole and also the Miccosukee of Florida have had to overcome through the past 2 centuries. I think that's probably the most important part of the story, which is to realize that the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe of Florida have maintained themselves in the state and have protected themselves and have, achieved the society and culture that they have today through, more than 150 years of intense struggle and actually armed combat. And modern Floridians should have a greater appreciation for the fact that as indigenous peoples of Florida, they deserve a lot of respect and certainly have a claim to being Floridians that's almost superior to anybody else's claim, probably because of what they had to go through to maintain their identity and their culture.
The Seminole weren't going out looking for trouble, but this seems to be the beginning part of where trouble came looking for them. That maybe has not really stopped up to the present day. How do you feel about that?
I haven't really been into the area of where the Miccosukee tribe lives so much. I've been down to Big Cypress and other Seminole communities many times. And Seminole culture, Miccosukee culture are both extraordinary cultures. And Floridians should feel lucky to have such a vibrant Native American culture as part of their state. But I do think that to some extent we also have an obligation to educate our 20 million residents now in where Florida came from, where modern Florida came from, and of the significance of many of the different populations that we have in the state. We don't do a good job of teaching state history in the state of Florida. One consequence of that, it makes a lot of our history invisible when it shouldn't be.
What else have you written about the Seminole or the Seminole Wars?
I did a book chapter about Payne, the leader of the Alachua Seminole, and that's kind of why I know a little bit about what his policy was during the early 1800s. And then Sherry Johnson, professor of Latin America and colonial America at FIU, and I edited a book on Andrew Jackson in Florida. It was a reader that consisted of previously published articles in the Florida Historical Quarterly and then some new essays written by Jackson scholars. And of course, a significant portion of that deals with Jackson and the First Seminole War. We also deal with his time as governor as well in that book. So that's primarily what I've worked on that's related to Seminole history and to the history of the Seminole Wars. I've kind of moved into a different area now. I'm working on a book now which is actually going to be about crime investigation in colonial Florida. It does have a Seminole link to it because I have a case where a convict in Saint Augustine kills a Seminole warrior and wounds another one. And the governor has to move very quickly to apprehend the convict and to try him because this killing took place at a time when Seminole, again, many of the Alachua Seminoles were congregating near Seminole as part of a talk with the governor that was going to occur. And he had to hold various meetings with the kin of the slain man and the wounded man, who of course wanted to know what the retribution was, what the justice was going to be against the convict who had committed the killing. So kind of an interesting court case because of its direct involvement with a crime against a Native American. Those are the things that I'm largely working on, and I try and keep up with all the new work that's coming out on both the Seminole Wars and the history and culture of the Seminoles. I was fortunate a couple of years ago to be guest editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly, and Patsy West submitted her article-length biography of Sam Jones, RP. I hope that we're going to see a book-length biography soon because his history and story is just, completely fascinating. And besides that, she's dug out references to him and, memoirs about him and people's recollections of him from all over the place, so that she really has great material for writing his life. And the article wonderfully written, but I do remember that to get it to fit into that issue of the Quarterly, I had to cut it in about in half. So there was a lot more material than what actually made it into the Quarterly. She single-handedly, I think, brought him from being a shadowy figure that everybody knows about but nobody knows any particulars about, to really, writing a full-fledged biography where we know his upbringing, who he was closest to, and where he was, through his long life, and the role he played in the Second Seminole War. It's a really good piece.
Jim Cusick, thank you so much for being with us on the Seminole Wars.
Yeah, I really appreciate being invited and having a chance to talk about all these things, and so thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this show, please take a moment to like us on Facebook at Seminole Wars Foundation. Leave a review on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. Your reviews and comments help new listeners discover us and help us keep the show going. Visit our website at www.seminolewars.us for blogs, articles, news, books, events, membership information, and how to subscribe to this podcast. We'll be back soon with a new episode of the Seminole Wars Podcast. The Seminole Wars Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to preservation, education, and publication of Seminole Wars history throughout the state of Florida. This podcast is copyrighted the Seminole Wars Podcast 2020, all rights reserved. Front bumper music, The Devil's Garden, Roast 'em, provided by kind permission of Reedy Youngman. Back bumper music, Second Seminole Win, by Jed Merrim and Ricky Pittman, courtesy of Ricky Pittman, all rights reserved.